In the spring of 1943, Europe was locked in a state of exhaustion. The third year of the war had turned the continent into a vast field of destruction, where the front lines moved slowly and every meter gained cost thousands of lives. Germany still held vast territories from the Atlantic to Stalingrad, but its resources were rapidly dwindling. The United States, having entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, was expanding its military power and preparing for large-scale operations in North Africa and Europe. The conflict had reached a phase where its outcome depended not only on machines and numbers, but on human endurance and belief in the purpose of the struggle. On the Western Front, Allied supply lines strengthened, and U.S. and British bombers struck German industrial regions. The skies over the Ruhr and Hamburg roared with engines by day, while sirens wailed at night. Inside the Reich, beneath the weight of bombings and censorship, life retained an outward sense of order, but fatigue permeated every home. Young men were sent to the front, leaving their families behind in fear and uncertainty. In a small Bavarian town, 23-year-old Obergefreiter Werner Müller prepared for transfer to the West. He had already fought on the Eastern Front, survived the brutal Russian winters, and lost most of his comrades near Vyazma. Now his unit was being redeployed to France to fortify defensive lines against a potential Allied invasion. Werner was not a fanatic or an idealist. He obeyed orders, yet increasingly questioned what this war was truly for. He had seen burned villages, starving refugees, and prisoners of war, and he understood that the conflict had long since lost any sense of heroism. It had become mechanical, relentless, a vast machine of destruction. Across the Atlantic, 25-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant Thomas Harper trained at a camp near New York. Born in Ohio, he had worked on a farm and dreamed of peace after the hardships of the Great Depression. When America entered the war, he volunteered, believing it was his duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. For him, Germany was not a personal enemy, but an abstract threat, a symbol of evil that had to be stopped. Training was grueling, but the American army was rapidly transforming into a formidable force. Thomas had no idea that in just a few months, he would set foot on European soil and face the enemy directly. On 12 April 1943, Werner arrived in Normandy, where German engineers were fortifying the coast. Bunkers were built, obstacles placed, mines laid, and defenses rehearsed. Soldiers lived in constant anticipation. Intelligence reports warned of an Allied landing, but no one knew when it would come. Evenings were cold and windy. Lights from enemy aircraft flickered over the sea. Werner grew accustomed to waiting. Yet every day, he felt that something decisive was drawing near. At the same time, Thomas and his company were stationed in Britain's Devon County, training alongside the British Army for future operations. The atmosphere was tense but determined. Everyone knew an invasion was coming, and each man understood that survival was uncertain. Thomas wrote home describing the mood as calm before the storm, his words carrying restrained hope that concealed quiet fear. The spring of 1943 became a prelude to convergence, the point at which millions of fates would cross upon one continent. For Werner and Thomas, this meeting would mean more than a clash of armies. It would be a confrontation of worlds raised on opposite shores of the ocean. Neither sought glory, both wanted simply to survive. But war did not ask what its participants wanted. It united and destroyed, creating strange bonds between those destined to be enemies. In the months to come, the front lines would shift again. Both soldiers would find themselves in battles that would determine the future of the war. For now, they lived in waiting, building fortifications, checking weapons, counting the days until fate made its choice. The story of Werner Müller and Thomas Harper was only beginning, and before it ended, enemies would learn to see each other not as targets, but as men. The summer of 1943 brought change to every front. Germany still held its lines, but the pressure from the Allies intensified. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched massive offensives, and at Kursk, German forces faced for the first time the impossibility of turning the tide. In the West, Anglo-American forces consolidated control in North Africa and prepared to invade Italy. The air was heavy with the sense that the war had entered a new phase one, in which strategic initiative was slipping from German hands. For Obergefreiter Werner Müller, this period became a time of uneasy stillness. His unit was stationed near the city of Caen, tasked with strengthening defensive positions. Day after day, the soldiers dug trenches, erected concrete barriers, stretched barbed wire, and checked minefields. The monotonous labor exhausted them more than combat itself. Occasionally, Allied reconnaissance aircraft appeared in the skies, and German anti-aircraft guns opened fire, almost always in vain. In those moments, Werner felt how fragile their defenses really were. He understood that when the storm finally came, no wall of concrete would stop it. He maintained discipline, carried out orders, and kept his men in line. Yet he could not ignore the growing fatigue in their faces, not the exhaustion of work, but the deeper fatigue of hopelessness. No one believed in quick victory anymore. Rumors of losses on the Eastern Front and fuel shortages in the West spread rapidly, despite censorship. Werner knew that one day the Americans and British would come, and that the clash would be inevitable. Meanwhile, in England, Thomas Harper completed the final stages of his training. His unit had been assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, which was expected to participate in the future invasion of France. The exercises grew increasingly demanding: forced marches, live fire drills, landing operations, and coordination with tanks and aircraft. Command demanded precision. Mistakes were not tolerated. Thomas accepted the routine quietly, but understood that real war would be nothing like training. He saw how new recruits flinched at artillery fire and realized that not all of them would survive the first battle. By the autumn of 1943, the Allies launched their campaign in Italy. The landings at Salerno and the battles near Naples revealed how costly each kilometer of Europe would be. These events foreshadowed what awaited Normandy. Thomas followed the news closely. He knew that the next step, the invasion of France, would be the most dangerous yet. At the same time, Werner observed how the defenses around him expanded into a labyrinth of bunkers and machine gun nests. His superiors spoke of the Atlantic Wall as an impregnable fortress. But Werner saw the flaws: outdated weapons, poor supply, and soldiers too young or too old to withstand sustained combat. The slogans of invincibility rang hollow against the reality before him. By the end of 1943, the fates of the two soldiers continued to move toward each other. One was preparing to attack, the other to defend. Between them lay thousands of kilometers of ocean and only a few months of time separating them from their inevitable meeting. The war, relentless and impersonal, was compressing the world, drawing enemies closer together until there would be no distance left between them. The winter of 1943-1944 brought cold and uncertainty to Europe. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army continued its advance into Ukraine and Belarus. In the West, German command waited anxiously for the Allied strike, uncertain where it would fall: Norway, Belgium, or France. Under Field Marshal Rommel's supervision, work intensified along the Channel coast. Bunkers rose, minefields spread, and ports bristled with fortifications. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, formidable on paper, but in truth, a patchwork of incomplete defenses. Obergefreiter Werner Müller served in an engineering detachment attached to the 716th Infantry Division near Caen. His duties included inspecting coastal positions, maintaining minefields, and coordinating with sapper units. Every day he filed reports, though he sensed that no amount of steel or concrete would stop an enemy determined to land in force. He saw the weariness in his men, the shortages in supplies, and the declining quality of replacements, too young, too old, untrained. In January 1944, Werner received a short leave and returned home to Bavaria. The town that once seemed peaceful now lived under the sound of air raid sirens and the glow of burning skies. Food lines stretched along the streets, and women wore mourning bands. Even at home, there was no real rest. Conversations were filled with exhaustion and quiet fear, mixed with a hidden wish for the war to end. 10 days later, Werner was back in Normandy, drawn again to the gray sea and the endless labor of fortification. Across the Channel, Thomas Harper was training on the coast of Devon. The Allied operation now had a name, Overlord, and its preparations had reached a fevered pace. Soldiers drilled daily with tanks, aircraft, and landing craft. Every detail was rehearsed, every contingency discussed. The command kept strict secrecy, but rumors circulated quickly. Everyone understood that the long-awaited order would soon come. February and March, 1,944 passed in restless anticipation. The weather remained harsh, but the troops trained relentlessly. Thomas watched new equipment arrive, vehicles, ammunition, rations, and realized the operation's scale was far greater than anyone could grasp. He no longer questioned its purpose. War had become a routine. His letters home grew shorter. There was no more room for emotion, only for facts. In April, the Allies launched a major aerial campaign over France. Bombers systematically destroyed railways, bridges, and communication lines. Werner saw the aftermath: scorched convoys, shattered roads, villages reduced to ash. Each bombardment was a reminder that the invasion was coming closer. German forces strengthened night patrols, manned anti-aircraft posts, and remained on alert 24 hours a day. By May 1944, an oppressive silence hung over the coast. German troops rotated shifts, maintained their weapons, and waited. In the staff rooms, officers debated possible landing sites, few believing it would happen in Normandy. Werner's unit manned the stretch between Arromanches and Colleville, watching the sea and marking time, knowing something irreversible was about to begin. Meanwhile, Thomas received sealed orders. His company was to be part of the first assault wave. Soldiers were issued new maps and envelopes labeled "to be opened only at sea." He needed no confirmation the operation was imminent. The night before embarkation was quiet. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. By early June, the two soldiers, one German, one American, were separated by only a narrow strip of sea. One guarded the shore, the other prepared to cross it. The war, after 5 years of destruction, was approaching its decisive hour. The 6th of June, 1944, began with strong winds and low clouds. The Atlantic storm was subsiding, but the waves still struck hard against the Normandy coast. For German troops, the morning seemed ordinary. Radio reports mentioned only minor skirmishes along the shoreline. Few officers suspected that beyond the horizon, a fleet was gathering the largest armada in the history of Europe. Werner Müller was at his section of the defensive line near Omaha Beach. His unit had been placed on full alert at dawn when the sound of engines filled the sky. At first, it seemed like another reconnaissance flight. Then the clouds split apart, and hundreds of transport aircraft appeared. In moments, the sky became a vast belt of shadows and thunder. Parachutes opened in the distance, drifting down in white clusters behind the German lines. Out at sea, ships were advancing small landing craft first, then heavy barges and transports escorted by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Werner understood immediately. This was no raid. It was an invasion. Moments later, naval artillery began its barrage. The ground shook violently. Sand and stone burst into the air. Bunkers trembled under impact. Communications lines went dead. Many positions were destroyed before they could return fire. For the German soldiers on the coast, The opening minutes felt like the end of the world. Explosions merged into a single roar, the air filled with smoke and debris. Werner tried to keep his men organized, directing them toward alternate firing points, but orders were drowned out by the thunder of guns. Meanwhile, far out at sea, Sergeant Thomas Harper stood in a landing craft packed tight with soldiers, the air thick with fuel and fear. Sailors shouted commands over the waves. The sound of artillery echoed even here. Men gripped their helmets in silence. Seawater splashed inside the craft, rising around their legs. When a shell screamed overhead and exploded nearby, the boat rocked hard. There was no turning back. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave reached the shore. The surf threw the landing craft against the sand, and soldiers leapt into waist-deep water, running toward the beach under a storm of bullets. The sand was torn apart by explosions. Bodies scattered across the rising tide. The Americans sought cover behind steel obstacles and fragments of wrecked vehicles. Every meter forward cost dozens of lives. Thomas ran with the others, seeing nothing but motion and smoke, the beach, the surf, the sound of men falling. On the bluffs above, Werner's unit continued firing as long as ammunition lasted, yet the attack was overwhelming. Naval shells shattered one position after another. By noon, his radio was silent, and only a handful of soldiers remained. Ordered to fall back toward secondary lines, Werner gathered the survivors and moved inland through broken terrain. The day dragged on in chaos. By evening, Allied forces had secured the beaches. German counterattacks failed to regain ground. The Allies controlled the air, the sea, and soon, the land. As the sun sank behind the gray horizon, Thomas Harper stood on the sand, now littered with wreckage and silence. Smoke drifted over the sea. He looked at what remained of the landing, the debris, the wounded, the lifeless bodies. Somewhere, only a few kilometers away, a German soldier named Werner Müller limped through the woods, leading what was left of his men. 6 years of war had brought them to this narrow stretch of coast, the place where enemies would see each other not through a gun sight, but as human beings caught in the same storm. The 7th of June, 1944, brought even greater devastation to Normandy. In the 24 hours since the landings, the coast had turned into a wasteland of smoke and wreckage. The Allies poured in reinforcements, hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, and supplies. The fortifications that had taken years to build were now little more than rubble. The remnants of German units retreated inland, trying to form new defensive lines. Obergefreiter Werner Müller moved through the wooded countryside, leading toward Cayenne, accompanied by a handful of soldiers from his shattered company. They carried what ammunition they could and tended to their wounded. The air reeked of fuel and ash. On the roads lay overturned trucks and burned-out tanks. Allied aircraft roamed the skies, attacking anything that moved. German forces lost cohesion. Radio communications were unreliable, and officers made decisions blindly. For Werner, this was no longer the same war he had once known. On the Eastern Front, chaos had been familiar, but here it felt different, systematic, relentless, and one-sided. The enemy possessed total dominance in the air and endless resources. Daylight movement was suicide. Soldiers hid among hedgerows and moved only at night. Every sound carried the threat of discovery. Meanwhile, Thomas Harper and his division were advancing inland. After seizing the beaches, the Americans began clearing small villages and road junctions. The fighting was slow and brutal. Each farmhouse, each stone wall, became a fortress. Infantry advanced behind tanks, but even with overwhelming power, casualties were severe. In the first 3 days after the landing, the division lost thousands of men. Thomas saw faces drained of color, men who had aged years in hours. The French countryside was narrow and clogged with vehicles. Mud and rain turned every field into a mire. Progress came in meters, not miles. The front lines buzzed constantly. Engines, shouts, artillery. Thomas grew used to the background of chaos. Werner watched from the ruins of a farmhouse where his group had taken shelter. He counted the remaining men. 8, still alive. 3 seriously wounded. They shared what food remained and drank from a nearby stream. At night, distant flashes lit the horizon. Sometimes other German groups passed by, scattered, leaderless, some barely armed. The army that had once conquered Europe was dissolving into fragments. On the morning of June 9, reports came that the Allies had reached the highway to Caen. Orders arrived to hold defensive positions along the nearby villages, though few believed it possible. Werner saw men dig shallow trenches with trembling hands. Their strength spent long before the battle began. For Thomas, the same days were marked by exhaustion and determination. His company moved carefully through mined fields and ambushes. Engineers led the way, clearing paths inch by inch. Every sound, every rustle in the hedgerows could be a trap. They ate cold rations, slept on wet ground, and advanced again. Despite everything, morale held. The men sensed they were part of something irreversible, the return of Europe's freedom. By mid-June, the front stabilized. The Germans entrenched near Caen, while the Allies built supply bases around Bayeux. Rain poured without pause, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Each day repeated the last. Artillery fire, casualties, brief movements, more waiting. Werner continued to record notes in his worn notebook, short lines about disappearing villages, lost comrades, the distant thunder of planes. Thomas, at the same time, took part in clearing small towns, each one a pocket of resistance fading under Allied pressure. The distance between the two men shrank with every passing day. The front lines narrowed to a few kilometers, and the war was quietly arranging their meeting, a chance encounter that would test everything they had come to believe about enemies and survival. On the 17th of June, 1944, the front near Caen had become a zone of relentless bombardment. The Allies pressed forward. German forces clung desperately to their remaining ground. The landscape was a patchwork of shattered villages, fields, and hedgerows, natural fortresses that turned every advance into a battle of attrition. Progress was measured in meters. Werner Müller served in a defensive detachment holding a small sector near the village of Saint-Pierre. His group numbered barely 20 men, half of them new recruits. Artillery pieces were gone, ammunition nearly depleted. Supplies no longer reached them. Allied planes ruled the skies. Radio communication flickered on and off. Werner distributed what little ammunition remained, reinforced the machine gun nests, and prepared for the attack expected at dawn. Across the line, the U.S. 29th Infantry Division was preparing to advance through the hedgerows. Sergeant Thomas Harper's platoon had been ordered to take a ridge suspected to contain German gun positions. They waited through the night, silent in the rain. At first light, under cover of a heavy artillery barrage, the Americans began their assault. The ground trembled as shells exploded ahead. Thomas moved forward through the hedges, weighed down by gear and mud. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and wet soil. Ahead came bursts of machine gun fire. Bullets cut through the leaves. Earth flew upward in sudden jets. In the chaos, the front dissolved. Lines vanished. Men crawled, stumbled, or froze in confusion. Werner's men opened fire when the attackers drew within 100 meters. For minutes that felt like hours, the firefight raged. Explosions and screams merged into one unbroken roar. Then, as the Allied artillery shifted its aim, a shell struck Werner's position. The blast threw him to the ground. Pain and ringing silence filled his head. When he regained consciousness, the world around him was still. His comrades lay motionless. Smoke hung over the ruined trench. He tried to stand, but his leg gave way. Blood seeped through torn fabric. Dragging himself with his arms, Werner crawled toward a thicket, away from the shattered position. His breathing was shallow, his thoughts drifting. At the same time, Thomas Harper advanced cautiously across the same field, part of a sweep to clear the area after the assault. Smoke and dust blurred everything. When he noticed movement among the hedges, he raised his rifle and froze. It was not an armed soldier, but a wounded man in a tattered uniform, struggling to bandage his leg. For a few seconds, neither moved. Thomas saw a face drawn with exhaustion and pain, not hatred, only the instinct to live. The soldier looked back, wary but silent. Around them, the battle had already moved on. Thomas reached into his pack, pulled out a bandage, and tossed it within the man's reach. No words were spoken. The German grasped it and began to tie it around his wound. Artillery fire erupted again in the distance, forcing Thomas to dive into a nearby crater. When the shelling ceased, he looked again. The man was still there. Acting on impulse, Thomas set down his canteen beside the wounded soldier before moving back toward his unit. Within minutes, an American patrol arrived and took both men, Werner as a prisoner, Thomas back to the line. For Werner, that brief encounter marked the moment when war ceased to be a matter of nations and became a question of survival and decency. For Thomas, it was the first time he saw the enemy as more than a uniform. The battle moved on, but the image of that silent exchange, a bandage and a canteen amid the ruins, would remain with both men long after the gunfire faded. On that day, in the chaos of Normandy, humanity had briefly outweighed duty. By the 20th of June, 1944, the Caen sector remained engulfed in fierce fighting. The Allies pushed forward, and German forces, scattered and depleted, retreated from one village to the next. Among the growing number of prisoners captured each day was Obergefreiter Werner Müller. He had been taken after receiving medical aid at a forward dressing station. Weakened and burned, he was alive, barely. The prisoners were gathered in makeshift enclosures behind the front lines. Conditions were harsh but orderly. Medical attention was limited to the severely wounded, while the rest received water and rations. None knew what awaited them. Men accustomed to following orders now faced complete uncertainty. Werner lay beneath a canvas sheet, listening to the rumble of Allied supply trucks passing by and the distant thud of artillery. He did not dwell on defeat. Instead, he pondered the strange fact of survival. One image returned again and again, the face of the American soldier who had thrown him a bandage and left a canteen. That single act, brief and wordless, had shattered the logic of war. Werner did not know the man's name or unit and would likely never learn it, but the memory stood as proof that even in destruction, a trace of humanity could endure. Elsewhere, Sergeant Thomas Harper was recovering in a field hospital. His division had suffered heavy casualties. Officers were replaced. Fresh recruits arrived daily. Thomas bore a minor shrapnel wound and was temporarily withdrawn from combat. The hospital occupied a damaged school building. Its walls were lined with cots. The air was heavy, with antiseptic and exhaustion. While waiting for his bandages to be changed, Thomas watched as groups of German prisoners were led across the courtyard, the same men who had fought them only days before. Their faces were young, drawn, and weary. Some carried stretchers for their wounded comrades. One man limped slightly, his posture steady despite obvious pain. Thomas paused, struck by a flicker of recognition. Perhaps it was only imagination, yet the image stayed with him. Days passed in a blur. Thomas soon returned to active duty, advancing south with his unit. Each step deeper into France widened the distance from the beaches, but not from the memory of that moment. He began to see the enemy differently, not as faceless targets, but as men caught in the same machinery of war. The conflict ceased to be a struggle of ideologies. It became For him, a test of human endurance and empathy. Werner, meanwhile, was transferred to a larger prisoner of war camp in Normandy. Thousands of soldiers filled the fenced enclosures. The conditions were Spartan yet stable: basic food, medical care, and light labor. Some prisoners worked unloading supplies or repairing equipment. Letters were permitted, though replies rarely came. In the evenings, Werner wrote brief notes in a small notebook, fragments of thought, not about battles, but about the need to remember, that fleeting instant of mercy. By July 1944, the Allied advance had captured Caen. Thomas was among the troops entering its ruins. The streets were unrecognizable, charred vehicles, collapsed buildings, burnt-out letters strewn among rubble. He no longer looked for meaning in it. He simply moved forward, understanding that the war would leave behind not triumph, but memory. In the camp, Werner watched new waves of prisoners arrive daily. The war, once vast and loud, now seemed distant, replaced by a slow rhythm of labor, meals, and silence. Yet amid that monotony, he held on to a quiet conviction that what he had witnessed on that June morning mattered. Both men now lived in separate worlds, one free, one confined, but bound by a single recollection, a moment when war paused and humanity prevailed. It was not a promise spoken aloud, but a silent understanding between two survivors of chaos. The spring of 1945 finally brought Europe the long-awaited end of war. Germany surrendered on May 8, and over its ruined cities hung a silence made of exhaustion, confusion, and fear of what lay ahead. Millions of soldiers returned from prisons, hospitals, and battlefields, trying to understand what it meant to live after years of destruction. The war that had lasted 6 years ended not in triumph, but in fatigue. Werner Müller greeted the news of capitulation in a prisoner of war camp in western France. By then, discipline had relaxed and conditions improved. The Allies began repatriating prisoners, though the process was slow. Werner spent his days at simple labor unloading trucks, repairing equipment, caring for the sick. In the evenings, he sat near the fence, watching the sun sink over the sea and thinking about how time itself seemed suspended. He did not think in terms of guilt or victimhood. Those words had lost their meaning. The war had stripped away ideology, leaving only fragments of memory. One image remained vivid, the face of the American soldier emerging from smoke, the canteen set beside him. Werner did not know if that man had survived or even what his name had been. Yet that act had become a symbol, proof that even when everything collapses, a human being can still choose compassion. In the autumn of 1945, Werner was released and sent home to Bavaria. His town lay in ruins. Streets were filled with refugees, the walls of buildings covered with Allied decrees. Life resumed, fragile and uncertain. Werner found work in a repair workshop, fixing machinery, helping neighbors rebuild. In his old notebook, once filled with terse wartime entries, he began writing again, this time about ordinary things: bread, rain, and the faces of people trying to live anew. At the same time, Sergeant Thomas Harper returned to the United States. He was welcomed with honors, but without celebration. The war had left invisible marks that no medal could erase. Back in Ohio, he worked on a farm, married, and started a family. Life regained its rhythm, yet some nights he woke to the echo of distant gunfire. In those moments, he remembered the beach, the smoke, and the silent decision he had made not to kill. In 1954, 10 years after the Normandy landings, Thomas joined other veterans on a trip to France for a commemoration ceremony. Rows of white crosses stretched toward the horizon at Omaha Beach. Soldiers of different nations stood side by side, their uniforms replaced by civilian coats. Among them were former German soldiers, now ordinary men, gathered to honor the dead. Werner was among them. He had come to France as part of a reconstruction program and stayed a few extra days to visit the places where he had once fought. At the ceremony, their paths crossed again, without recognition, without words, simply as two men standing in the same silence. As the wind moved, the flags and the hymn played over the dunes. Thomas looked at the man beside him, older, solemn, his cap held over his chest. The man looked out toward the sea. For an instant, their eyes met calm, without fear or bitterness. Neither knew that the other had once stood on the opposite side of that same shore. It was a quiet fulfillment of an unspoken promise, the promise to remember that even amid war, humanity can endure. After the ceremony, they went their separate ways, unaware that fate had crossed their paths twice, once in battle and once in peace. The years between those moments had changed everything except the meaning of that silent choice. The war had destroyed millions of lives, but in its ashes, small remnants of compassion survived sparks that refused to die. The story of Thomas Harper and Werner Müller never reached history books, never became legend. It lived only in the memory of two men who had seen war and chosen mercy. Their brief meeting remained a reminder that even enemies can become brothers when they stop fighting long enough to see each other as human.